Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. We've all heard the tragic myth of wasted potential in football, right? You know, the wonder kids, those teenage prodigies who were supposedly destined to rule the pitch for a decade, only just fade away into obscurity. Well, today, we're going to unpack the actual clinical truth behind why so many promising footballing careers derail.
And that brings us to a really massive question. Where do fallen stars go? I mean, we constantly build up these young players with incredible hype. We expect them to be icons, heroes, legends that'll last forever. But what actually happens when they suddenly vanish into silence without so much as a farewell? One minute, they're making headlines, and the next, they're basically just memories.
Just think about names like Freddie Adu or Mario Balotelli. Remember when Freddie Adu was dubbed the next Pele at just 14 years old? Or Balotelli, who had literally all the physical and technical gifts in the world. Jack Wilshere, Adriano, Dele Alli, you've seen these names on endless listicles ranking the biggest wasted talents. They're so often written off by the public and the press for having bad attitudes, unmanageable mentalities, or, excessive partying lifestyles.
Sir Alex Ferguson once famously said, "Hard work will always overcome natural talent when natural talent does not work hard enough." And honestly, fans and managers usually nod along with this pretty harsh perspective. We tend to assume that a player's failure to launch is simply a lack of dedication or professionalism. We see a downfall, and we instantly point the finger at their work ethic.
But then you contrast that with this incredibly chilling quote from a clinical counselor. They noted that one player felt like the game that he loved had attacked him. Wow. That completely changes the narrative, doesn't it? It reveals the crippling psychological weight and the genuine trauma these athletes endure behind the scenes. It's not just about laziness or partying. There's a deeply human, deeply painful reality here that completely gets masked by tabloid headlines.
Which brings us to Section 1, the hidden catalyst, injury. When we look at the hard clinical data from Brunel University, the script completely flips on why these downfalls actually happen. When PFA counselors were asked how many of their clients had experienced an injury, the estimates were shockingly high. One counselor noted that an estimated 90 to 95% of players seeking mental health support have a history of long-term injury. Think about that. The physical breakdown is almost always the invisible precursor to the mental struggles.
So the crucial takeaway here is that those superficial judgments we make as fans about partying, laziness, or a bad attitude, they are completely at odds with the clinical reality. What looks like a bad attitude on the pitch is often clinically documented as severe depression, active addiction, and a paralyzing fear of re-injury. As fans, we're out there judging the symptoms without ever really acknowledging the disease.
Let's move into Section 2, the psychological toll. Now, we're going to intentionally pivot from the pitch over to the clinic to examine the darker consequences outlined by the professional counselors who work with these isolated athletes every single day. This clinical data categorizes the specific psychological disruptions that can just totally shatter a player's world. Looking at these consequences broken down into themes of psychological disruption and avoidant behavior, it becomes clear we aren't just talking about a player feeling a bit down about missing a match. It's a complete dismantling of their mental well-being.
When severe injuries strike, these isolated players face severe depression, which is characterized by negative emotional reactions, helplessness, and outright anger. And because of the sudden inactivity and low self-esteem, they become highly vulnerable to eating disorders, sometimes feeling like they literally don't deserve food because they aren't out there playing. But perhaps the most terrifying risk of all is the loss of identity. Just imagine being forced into retirement or a prolonged absence when your entire sense of self, literally since childhood, has been tied exclusively to being a footballer. The crisis is absolutely immense. And of course, the constant overuse of painkillers just to get back on the pitch, that can easily spiral into long-term substance dependency.
This clinical data perfectly frames the real trajectories of players we talked about earlier. Take Jack Wilshere. Before Bukayo Saka was Arsenal's star boy, it was Wilshere, right? He was dominating a prime Barcelona midfield at just 19 years old, but his body just broke down repeatedly. At one point, surgeons actually thought he might not ever walk properly again, let alone play professional football. Or consider Dele Alli, who bravely opened up to the world about his immense childhood trauma and the deep-seated issues that plagued his seemingly rapid fall from grace. It wasn't just a sudden loss of form, it was physical breakdown violently colliding with unhealed trauma.
That takes us to Section 3. Escaping the pain.
As the psychological pressure mounts from these injuries and the resulting isolation, we really have to look at how these young athletes try to escape their agonizing reality. I mean, how do you cope when the only thing you know how to do is suddenly ripped away from you?
Well, they cope through what clinicians call avoidant behaviors. PFA counselors note that players turn to hidden gambling addictions, painkiller misuse, alcohol, or even avoiding football entirely. Some literally have to leave the room if a match is on TV because it just hurts too much to watch. What's especially crucial to understand here is that gambling has become a massive epidemic for players in isolation. And why is that? Because, as one counselor pointed out, a gambling addiction doesn't show up physically on a training ground drug test. It is the absolute perfect hidden escape.
So there's this massive disconnect between what we see in the media and what's actually happening inside the mind of the player. What the public views as a scandalous headline like Adrian Mutu's dramatic cocaine ban at Chelsea, or a disciplinary comedy like Royston Drenthe arriving late to Everton training in a Rolls-Royce, or sneaking friends into the training ground hot tub in the middle of the night, is often just the visible manifestation of deep psychological avoidance. We laugh at the absurdity or we angrily condemn the scandal, but we're completely missing the very real mental health crisis that is driving those exact destructive behaviors.
And finally, Section 4, Life Beyond the Pitch. We really must look beyond the sport itself to understand the complex human beings behind these supposedly tragic sports narratives, because behind every single jersey is a real human story. Take Adriano. He was hailed as the heir to the great Ronaldo. He was lightning fast, strong as an ox. But he didn't just fail to reach his potential out of nowhere, he actually fell into a devastating depressive spiral after the sudden death of his father when he was only 22. Or look at Bojan Krukic, who was completely crushed by the heavy weight of severe anxiety and impossible expectations. And then there's Hidetoshi Nakata, who shocked the entire footballing world by retiring right at his peak. Not because his form declined, but because he simply chose life, travel, and culture over fame. Sometimes, disappearing is actually a conscious, incredibly healthy choice for peace.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and leaves us with a lingering, powerful question. Did they fail and disappear, or did they just move on to survive? The next time you see a list ranking wasted potential, I really hope you remember this clinical reality. Remember the trauma and the complex human beings behind the badge. Thanks so much for joining me to explore this fascinating data today. Keep asking questions. And always, always keep looking beyond the surface.